Well, here we are in the third week of our message series that we're calling The Power of Patient Love. This is our last series for the summer. We'll return to the message series in the fall after Labor Day, and this is the third and final week of The Power of Patient Love. And as we've mentioned, we're very familiar with the idea of love and its presence in our life and its power. It's very much at the heart of our Christian faith. But patience is not something, at least in our ordinary life, that we associate with power. Patience is, to be honest, more commonly associated in our culture with weakness. If you don't have the power to get what you want, well, I guess you have to be patient. But the truth is that patience and love are deeply connected. And so just as love is powerful, as we have all experienced, patient love too can be very powerful. And St. Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, was well aware of that fact. You are probably all familiar with St. Paul's great hymn to love, as it is called, a passage from one of his letters to the Corinthians in which he describes with beautiful language and exhilaration and exaltation the glories of love. So you're probably at least roughly familiar with that from having attended a Catholic or a Christian wedding. But do you remember how it begins? It begins in this way. Love is patient. Patience, like love, is easy to admire, but sometimes very difficult to achieve. But it really seems, on examination, you cannot have one without the other. Our first week, we considered God as a model for us of patient love. We considered the story that Jesus told his disciples about the weeds planted among the wheat, one of his parables, his teaching stories. And we saw in that story how the farmer's patience, as he waited for the harvest time before he tried to remove the weeds, the farmer's patience is an image of God's patient love for his world and for his children, for us. And so, like the farmer in the gospel, God is patient with us, giving us what we need, giving us nourishment, encouragement, and time, the time that we need to grow and become, if we're willing, who we're called to be. And we learned that just as God is patient with us, for us to grow in patience, which is what we all desire, for us to grow in patience, we also need to be patient with God, to trust in his good purposes for us and for our world, even in circumstances where it's very difficult for us to see, to discern those good purposes in the details of our life. To be, in other words, a hopeful people. And this hope, our trust in God and in his good purposes, is also then the foundation of our patience. Patience with God, but also our patience with one another, which we talked about last week. And we realized in that discussion that the only true road to patient love is a patient life. And to seek to live a patient life, or even, let's begin at the beginning, even to choose patience in challenging moments within our life, which is what we all desire also, that is countercultural. It runs a bit against the grain of how we're taught to assert ourselves and to behave in our society today. It's countercultural. The countercultural nature of that calling to patient love is exemplified when we consider that patience, in truth, not only involves what we think it involves, because when we're asked, we would all probably say this, patience involves waiting. That's one of the reasons why we think it may be more associated with weakness than with power. So we would say waiting involves patience, but in fact, there's more. If we draw a lesson from the word that is used to describe those who are under the care of a doctor or in a hospital, patience also involves suffering, at least in a certain extent. We call those people patients. Now that is because the word suffer doesn't need to mean purely physical, emotional, or psychological pain. That's not the full extent of the word. It has an older, wider, deeper meaning. And what that meaning is of the word suffer is to allow certain things to happen in our life. Things that we could avoid or control, but instead choose to accept, to suffer in that special, older, wider, deeper meaning of that word. And that most certainly is countercultural. Now, being patient with ourselves, the kind of patience that we're looking at this week, perhaps does not cut against the grain of our culture quite so much. We're all told and taught to take care of ourselves, to be kind to ourselves. So it's not perhaps quite so countercultural, but I think to be patient with ourselves is still challenging for many of us. Last week, I shared Pope Francis' words reminding us of God's patience with us, but those same words could just as well be used to encourage you and I to be patient with ourselves. The true pilgrim is capable of going at the pace of the slowest person. And Jesus, Pope Francis says, is capable of this. Jesus is our pilgrim companion. He respects our situation and does not accelerate the pace. He is the Lord of patience. What the Lord does for us, we should also do for ourselves, but we do not always manage it. We are hard on ourselves very often. The Pope's words and that exhortation I just gave you are supported by these words from one of the great teachers of our Catholic Christian tradition. Have patience with all things, but chiefly have patience with yourself. Do not lose courage in considering your own imperfections, but instantly set about remedying them. Every day, begin the task anew. Now, that was St. Francis de Sales, a great teacher, indeed a doctor of the Church. And his words are important, not just because he is a great saint and a teacher, a doctor, but because his teaching shows a deep understanding of the reality that our patience with ourselves will impact our ability to be patient with others. Love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus says. And so we are taught as Christians to examine our conscience for those moments in our life when we fail to love our neighbor. But we should also, at least occasionally, take stock of whether we have also failed to love ourselves. And just as our failure in patient love for our neighbor needs God's forgiveness and healing, so too our failure to show patient love for ourselves. Now, if this sounds a bit too wishy-washy for you, consider the Church's teaching on sin and its effects in our life. Stated most directly, we could say even paradoxically, we could say that the punishment for sin is becoming a person who sins. How can that be so? Well, consider. Every choice that you and I make, for good or for ill, becomes part of our history, becomes part of our life. It becomes part of us, who we are. Every choice that we make. And so, the effect of each choice for sin is, in a small way at least, us becoming someone who sins, someone whose next choice might be slightly more likely to be in that direction. And failing to love ourselves is no less a sin than failing to love our neighbor. We have said that the only road to patient love is through a patient life. But these days do not encourage us in patience, and perhaps particularly not in patience with ourselves. There are many examples, but let's choose one. We all enjoy looking at beautiful things, and for that matter, truth be told, at beautiful people. But in the media environment in which we live these days, we seem to be presented with nothing but beautiful things and beautiful people living beautiful lives. And it is difficult, immersed in this environment, as most of us are, to avoid comparing ourself, our life, and even the other places and people in our life with those beautiful images constantly being presented to us. And as we do that, we find they don't quite live up. We can become impatient with ourselves, with our life, and with our circumstances. Patience is not encouraged. But there is more. Because in truth also, consciously or unconsciously, many of us try to live that same imaginary life through our own social media by carefully choosing which photos and stories about our life that we share with others. And so, as we do this, as we look at carefully curated and managed images, not just of celebrities, but even of our friends, relatives, and neighbors, we end up causing each other to have even less patience with ourselves, and so therefore also in the long run with one another. That's not the path to which we are called. As the prophet Isaiah might say to us in those circumstances when we're focused and worried about those issues, as the prophet Isaiah might say to us, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? We, without Isaiah's guidance, become then impatient with ourselves, impatient with our circumstances, impatient with others. Our task and our goal then is to change this. How can we do it? How can we grow in patient love? Well, one American Protestant spiritual writer proposes a couple of questions that we can use to ask ourselves to check on just where we are on this situation. A kind of an examination of patience with ourselves. And he says, ask yourself this: how do you talk to yourself? We know and we try to take care in the way we speak with others. How do you talk to yourself? What is your way with yourself? Are you demanding, unforgiving, impatient? How are you in your relationship with yourself? Second, what about the expectations that you currently have for getting things done? Getting things done, accomplishment, is almost an idol in our culture. How do you see it? What are your expectations for yourself in that regard? Is efficiency the ruler of your life? Interesting questions, and one good way Eldridge tells us to answer them is to reflect more generally, to reflect on the pace that our life takes, the speed with which we're moving from one moment, from one activity, from one situation to another. What is the pace, you might ask yourself, that you are currently demanding of yourself? And would you put the same discipline, demand the same speed, the same pace of someone whom you love? And then ask the Lord, Lord, what is the pace that you want for me right now? It might turn out that it's very different indeed. Now, that question about the speed and the pace of our life is a timely one for us now, because we will all, directly or indirectly, likely be facing a transition in the next couple of months, a change of pace in our life, as life takes at least a step back towards what we might think of as normal with the return of school. Things will change. The speed of life will change as well. Acknowledging that this is only one step and that there's still a distance to go before we would return to the world we knew before, it's still not too early to ask ourselves some questions. So here is a bit of homework. Take some quiet time with God this week. You'll notice a theme to our homework. It's always involved quiet time, allowing God to speak to our heart. Take some quiet time with God and remember these past very, very unusual months. They're quite different from anything that came before. There are doubtless many things that you have missed during that time, things that have been taken away that you'll be happy to have back, but the chances are that there are also, if you cast your mind's eye back over that time, there were also some things that disappeared from your life that you may not have missed at all. You might be quite happy with some of the changes that happened. So ask yourself, how has this strange time that we have passed through, and in some sense are still passing through, how has this strange time allowed me to become more patient with God, with others, or even with myself? And what is it, or was it, about these circumstances that allowed you to do that allowed that change to happen in your life? And then finally, looking forward, what changes could I, or if it's the case of your family, what changes could we make as things begin to return to normal that would allow us to hang on to some of those good changes, those changes that allow us to be more patient, to hang on to the gift of patient love? What could we do that would allow those good things to persist? What could we change? And change is possible because God created and is still creating each one of us. And no matter how old we are, no matter how long we have lived, we are still only on the way to being the finished product. Most of us will become who we were created to be only as we finally enter into the Lord's presence. But our journey has already begun, so we have time. Because, as the psalmist reminded us today, the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Love is patient, and patient love is truly powerful. God's patient love gave his people wine and milk without price, as Isaiah promised. It gave us bread in a deserted place. So we can be confident that the same patient love will overcome our weaknesses, our failures, and our impatience. That it will help us become the person we desire to be, someone growing in patient love for God, for our neighbor, and for ourselves. That we can be confident that God's patient love will one day, not without struggle on our part, but without doubt, God's patient love will make us a person who is not only created by God, but also can be seen to be, to live and to exist in this world as the very image of God.